Welcome to Discussions of Truth. Metallica intro sticking. It's been a few months with that. Good Wednesday to you. Good whatever day it is for you. Should you be re-listening to this program on Windwood Radio, it has been picked up in iTunes. It is also picked up on the brand new Google Podcasts. So, should you be re-listening to this, keep re-listening and go back and listen to other episodes. Should you be listening live on windwoodradio.com? Thanks for joining. I'm your host, Ian Hamilton Trottier, and I urge you to donate to the program. Should you understand kind of the crux of what's going on here, and to help you do that, you can reflect on a recent episode with former CIA agent Ray McGovern, who basically ended his episode or interview or his time, rather, with me by saying, Ian, what Americans need to know and realize is that it is essentially programs like yours that are the last hope, or rather front line, of combating what he calls a not military-industrial complex, but rather a military-industrial congressional media complex. That coming from a man that spent 27 years in the CIA and has now had over 5 decades in Washington. So let me kind of help you understand a perspective of logic and point of view to take when looking at the various subjects that are addressed on this program. I was just moments ago speaking of genealogy. If that's something that interests you, great. It's something that has interested me and does interest me. And the question that was posed to me recently was, do you have any German in you, Ian? And, as a matter of fact, I don't see much German, but I have seen a lot of Danish. So there are a number of resources out there for you to kind of go back and look at where your tribal ancestry has walked prior to you. And my last name is French, so certainly I have French ancestry. My middle name is Hamilton. That's from my grandfather. I have Scottish ancestry. And my first name is Ian, which actually stems from Hebrew many, many, many years ago as Eon, E-O-N, but it's spelled I-A-N. That is the British version. I received that name from my British mother. If those are the types of things that interest you, then apply this concept to the very vague and crust logic of which I try to convey various topics. And the one today is banking. So if you were, for instance, a member of the aristocracy in England, that would be, let's just say, the monarchy of the royal family. Do they know their lineage? Yes, they know their lineage. Are they happy they are in power? Yes, they are happy they are in power. Would they want to relinquish that power? Absolutely not. So if you were born into an aristocratic family, you don't want to only not relinquish any of that power. It's just like if you have developed a incredibly large company or corporation, you don't want it to go bankrupt. You want it to always stay in business. And you want your children either to not continue the business per se, but to always receive the benefits of the wealth that business has developed. There are wealthy families that transcend multiple generations, and they have stayed in power for multiple generations. So for a guy like Ray McGovern to spend 5 decades in Washington, how old is this country? 1776, 250 years old? So that's a fifth of the lifetime of this country, if I've got my math right. That's not a whole lot of time. What I mean is the 250 years isn't a whole lot of time. So relative to him understanding kind of the ins and outs of what's happening in D.C. today, he's probably got a pretty good idea. So this is nothing new. And if you follow me on Instagram, which is IANTROTTIER, and if you want to make that donation, do so at IANTROTTIER.com. 50 cents goes a long way. Regardless, let me run by a quote for you. And you can cross-reference if you want. I've done the same. Benjamin Franklin. So we're going back to that 1776 mark. And here he's saying, the colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money. That was something called colonial scrip. SCRIP, I believe. Franklin goes on to say, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The inability of colonists to get power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of King George III of England at the time. And, Franklin says, and the international bankers. Who and what is he talking about there? And plural. He concludes the quote as saying, was the prime reason for the Revolutionary War. How does that kind of sink in to you? To know that in 1776, one of the most prolific men that this country has ever seen, that the world has ever seen, Benjamin Franklin, is having an issue with international bankers. 1915. Representative Louis T. McFadden. He had this to say. We have in this country, this is 1915. Keep in mind the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson in 1913. So it's a couple of years after that was signed into law. And you can also go back and you can find that Wilson, as he's leaving office, lamented the fact that he had signed that into law. But McFadden, Representative McFadden, is quoted as saying, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board. So, Ian, what is the Federal Reserve Board? What is the Federal Reserve? Is there anything federal about it? What is it? Who created it? Where does it stem from? It's not only is it a central bank, but it's a private central bank. McFadden goes on to say, this evil institution has impoverished the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted our government. 1915, about 100 years ago. So that would be twice what McGovern has spent in D.C. That makes sense? So it's really not that long ago. He concludes, it has done this through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. Let that resonate. What does that mean? And I'm going to go into one more quote. And then I'm going to go into a few guests that are slated for the program. And then we'll bring on today's guest who will be talking about central bankers. So, Charles A. Lindbergh, former United States Congressman at the time of saying this in 1922, is known to say this. The financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. The board administers the finance system by authority of a purely profiteering group. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. That would be, America, that would be your taxes. Your taxes. Oh, boy. Should there be a box that might be opened here? Let's see. Okay, coming up, we've got Robert Bridge. He's an American investigative journalist living in Moscow. He's a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and his book, Midnight in the American Empire, is a harsh critic of U.S. foreign affairs and policy. Bridge is the former editor-in-chief of Moscow News. He will be joining this program July 4th. Let me just say, if you Google his book, it's noted as saying, corporate America is no longer content doing what it does best, which is making money. These business behemoths are aggressively attempting to control the entire economy, culture, and political realms of American life. And, he says, they have nearly succeeded. What could he be talking about? Novus Ordo Seclorum? Don't know. We'll find out. Did I mention, if you've listened to me previously, that Daniel Estulin will be joining the program? He'll be talking about La Trastienda de Trump, his current book, Trump Behind the Scenes. Let's see. Peter Lance, 5-time Emmy Award winner, and currently running the website Investigating Trump. He's former guest on the program 2 times. So if you go back into my archive and any of these things kind of resonate with you, please listen to some of these other episodes. And finally, introducing to you, coming on the program slated for August 15th, Gretchen Peters. She spent a large portion of her career dissecting the war in Afghanistan. Oh, gosh. We've almost been in Afghanistan for 2 decades. Well, it's making somebody money. Is it making you money? and is it accomplishing what it's set out to do, which is, what are they? Is the U.S. military in there to kind of harness Al-Qaeda? After 2 decades, you haven't been able to harness Al-Qaeda? No. After 2 decades, perhaps there's not enough opium that's been harvested. Who knows? But anyway, Gretchen may have an idea. She's dissected the war in Afghanistan and its association with the heroin trade because, yes, opium produces heroin. She is a graduate of Harvard University and the University of Denver, Joseph Corbel School of International Studies, and prior to her current role as executive director of the Setau Project, Peters worked for the Associated Press and ABC News. She's been nominated for an Emmy on her coverage of the assassination of Benazir Bhutto. Her most compelling work comes in form of the book Seeds of Terror, and that would relate to her studies of the war of Afghanistan. Quoted by Barron's as being well-written, well-documented, an exemplary work of journalism. She lectures for such departments as the State Department, the NSA, the Navy SEALs, the Pentagon, George Mason University. So we're lucky enough to have her join us in August. If you go to iantrottier.com, you will find two former papers of Peters that I've got links to. They are government sites. One is from the United States Institute of Peace, How Opium Profits the Taliban, and Ala Al-McCoy, who's been a former guest on this program. As he got if you listen to this episode, he got a knock at his door as he had written his thesis, his PhD thesis at Yale. The knock was coming from the CIA, who wanted him to hand over the papers. See, he was onto something they didn't like. Well, they took him to court and he won. So that book that he has now, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, now stands as pretty much the golden rule to understanding drug trade in that vicinity. The other paper that Peters has that I have on my website that Peters has written is West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, the Haqqani Network. Okay. That's about enough here. Again, iantrottier.com, IANTROTTIER. You're tuned into Wynwood Radio. I'll be back momentarily with Nomi Prins.
Other girls that be on the corner, man, they be strictly dickly. Then oh my God, here comes the monster, man, they be strictly sickly. Other girls that be on the corner, man, they be strictly dickly.
Okay, and I am back. Today we have on an incredible guest. She has spent time at Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns. She has written extensively about the banking system that we all kind of feed into. And to get a better idea of exactly how to understand this, she has written a book called Collusion, How Central Bankers Rigged the World. We welcome to Wynwood Radio, Nomi Prins.
Thank you so much for having me on, Eden.
It is a pleasure. Nomi, for listeners, please give a little bit of background about your career, what you've done. I gave a rough layer there, and then bring us up to what's brought you to writing Collusion.
Sure, Ian, I'll do that. You did a great job of the sort of bullet points, but basically I started my career out of college on Wall Street at Chase back in the day as a programmer, and sort of went from there through really the world of different investment banks and commercial banks through to Lehman Brothers in New York to Bear Stearns in London, where I actually created their analytics department for London and for Europe, and then came back to New York to work in really the credit derivatives area, the part of Goldman Sachs that did the most kind of esoteric creations of securities and sort of investment advice for the biggest corporate clients of the firm. So I kind of ran the gamut, at which point I became really disillusioned towards the end of that career. And as I wound up at Goldman Sachs, with the way in which the industry had really changed. It was never an industry of charity, but it certainly changed into something adversarial to clients, I think, in terms of the types of products and ideas that were being pushed on clients. What I wanted to do on Wall Street, which was to really show the downside of trade, sort of give people and clients an opportunity to consider all aspects of what they were about to do. And that was more and more frowned upon in the business because it wasn't necessarily the way in which the most money could be made in the shortest period of time. So around that time, it was about 9/11, actually, a while back now. I quit to become a journalist and to work generally to inform the public, governments, and so forth throughout the world of what was going on inside Wall Street, because there just weren't enough people, I think, who really understood the mechanics of Wall Street, not just the mentality, but just how things were created and what they meant and the wealth they could extract as well as put in the hands of a select few. And I wound up writing 7 books, so not going through all of them, but Collusion really came out of a major loop in my career, which is I started out at Lehman Brothers talking with central banks around the world, and I did the same thing at Bear when I was in London. And central banks really used to just be kind of boring. There were institutions that were supposed to set rates, which they still do. They're supposed to regulate private banks, which they do badly. And they're supposed to just make sure that the system itself runs. And they failed miserably in doing that into the financial crisis of 2008, particularly the Federal Reserve in the United States, the U.S. central bank. And so what I decided to do is really trace what's happened in these last 10 years vis-a-vis particularly the Fed and other central banks throughout the world in terms of the amount of money they've literally created. I use the term conjured and things like it in Collusion together to keep the private banking system, institutions like Goldman Sachs, like JP Morgan Chase, alive and kicking and subsidized at the expense of really rigging the markets, of really creating an artificial situation in which the few players at the top receive inordinate amounts of money from the central banks, and everyone else is sort of dealing with a very different component of the market in their own economic lives. And that's where Collusion came from.
Fantastic. And let me throw this thought at you as I try to wrap around various kind of definitions as to what the Federal Reserve System is and how they compare to how it compares to Wall Street and private investment firms like what you've worked for. But the Federal Reserve, for instance, is supposed to be to average kind of to the average American taxpayer, 9-to-5 worker, hoping that their police departments get paid and the fire department gets paid. They're hoping or they're assuming that the Federal Reserve is a government regulated, that's U.S. government regulated system. To the best of your knowledge, is it a government regulated system or an organization?
No, actually, in reality, it's probably one of the least regulated organizations, period, private or actually federal. I mean, it certainly has that name attached to it, the Federal Reserve, and its main body. It's basically made up of 12 components of a central bank system, the Federal Reserve system, where the main one is located in Washington, D.C. The people that run it hobnob with all the elites in government and so forth. And the chairperson, the Board of Governors chair, is appointed by the President of the United States. And there has been no time since the Fed was conceived by the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 where the appointee of the president, whether it was a Democrat or Republican, was not approved through the protocol by Congress. So there's a connection in terms of the people that are on the board of governors that run the Federal Reserve. And the term board is very important because it really connotes what the Federal Reserve is, which is it's kind of like the company. It has a board of governors to kind of give it that sort of language of government. But the board of governors are really people on the board of the Federal Reserve, which is effectively a member organization whereby the members are the private banks of the United States. And the way it was set up to begin with was that and still the major private banks in the United States own shares in the Federal Reserve. So it's like people owning shares in a company, right? And the bigger the bank, the more shares they own in the Federal Reserve. And so if you're JP Morgan Chase, you own more than some local bank who might not even own any, in Miami or so forth. So that's basically how it works. And as a result of that, the idea that the Federal Reserve is also supposed to regulate these institutions gets a little fuzzy because these institutions are actually members of the Federal Reserve. So it's very synergistic. And so when there's a crisis, one of the things that the Federal Reserve is supposed to do is be the emergency lender of last resort. It's like if you have a financial crash personally, or like let's say a child has it, they go to their parent. In the case of the banking system, if a private bank has a problem making its payments, or is about to go bust or so forth, as many were in the onset of the financial crisis of 2008, the Federal Reserve is supposed to step in as that emergency lender of last resort and create a means by which the banks have access to more money than normal. They increase sort of the supply of that money to the private banks, and with that, the banks are supposed to heal, fix themselves and sort of move on. And the Federal Reserve is supposed to, again, continue to be that regulator of the banks. No one regulates, back to the beginning of the question, the Fed. There's no limitation. There's no legal limit to how much, for example, the Fed can create in terms of a money supply to fulfill what they consider to be an emergency situation and to fulfill their role in that situation as the emergency lender of last resort. So there is no limitation. There's no auditing. It doesn't trade on an exchange like a public company, so people can't really see what it's doing exactly or have the ability to ask questions that would make it more transparent. So it really operates in sort of this dark sort of lines between a private company being connected to Washington and physically present there and working to really replenish money to the private banking system that are members of the Federal Reserve. So it's a very unique organization that has a lot of pieces of different kinds of organizations, but are connected in a way that's very unique to the Federal Reserve System.
And is it safe to say that listeners should question the motives behind those stockholders in the Federal Reserve? And go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because and there's two levels why people should need to question this. One is that if these members, these shareholders in the Federal Reserve also happen to be beneficiaries of Federal Reserve policy, so that if they make mistakes or if they require emergency money, the Fed gives it to them because they're all really one institution. They're one sort of conglomerate really of private banking and central banking in one place, even though they operate in two different parts of the marketplace. That's a concern, because what that means is that private banks have kind of an incentive, or at least a perverse incentive, to know that if they screw up, if they bet too much, as long as they have the right connections and can make the right argument as to why they might need money to help fix the problems that they create, the Federal Reserve will be there to do that. And not only that, because the Federal Reserve has this sort of aura and narrative of being federal, of being for the people and so forth, even though that was not really how it was constructed, and that's not really in the Federal Reserve Act, but that's kind of the narrative under which it operates. It seems as if the Federal Reserve is supposed to make the financial system stable so that the economy is rendered stable if banks screw up. But in practice, because banks are members, they receive money, and they all sort of operate on a sort of collective basis. And the other reason why people should care about this is because, for example, as we've seen in the last 10 years, the Federal Reserve is one of its tools to help private banks get access to cheap money at basically 0% interest. Now, today it's a little bit higher, but for the most of the last 10 years, it was at zero. That means that people get 0% on their savings accounts. And so even when rates have risen from December 2015 until now by almost 2 percentage points, the amount that banks, these biggest banks that receive all of this extra help from the Federal Reserve, have provided to their own customers, for example, with savings accounts, is very, very minimal. And so the Fed will sort of raise or lower interest rates to help the banks. They say it's to help inflation and sort of adjust other prices, but in reality, the banks are the ones with the access to the money at the cheapest levels. And banks don't give that sort of ability to their customers. It just means that people are really shafted in the process of banks getting helped, and them not even receiving as much interest on their own savings accounts with these banks as banks are receiving with some of the assets that they basically pledge to the Fed as part of the relationship with the Fed. So people are getting sort of the short end of this stick, and that's why for many reasons they should care about how the Fed operates and how non-transparent it really is, despite public statements of what it does on a regular basis.
So it sounds a little like an oxymoron. The average American is putting their hard-earned savings or money in a commercialized bank like a Wells Fargo or a Bank of America, but then they're also kind of feeding this reserve system. And is it safe to say that their taxes, rather than going into the U.S. Treasury, are perhaps going into building that Federal Reserve? Is there any link there?
Well, it's kind of a link. It's a bit circuitous, because what happens is, as part of the structure of the Federal Reserve, banks are supposed to reserve money. It's basically like paying for their own insurance, right? So they're paying, or they're pledging reserve money, reserve capital to the Federal Reserve. So it stays at the Fed, and in return, in the last 10 years anyway, the Fed gives them interest on that capital. They used to not give interest on that capital. They used to basically retain those reserves in case there was an emergency. They could use the bank's own reserve money, their own money put aside for a rainy day or difficult day, and use that to help the banks. But what's happened in the last 10 years is that entire process has gone kind of haywire, because the Federal Reserve has been creating money in far in excess to what's been reserved by the banks, in order for the banks to have that money to use to become healthy, to buy their own stock, and to do lots of other things. And in the meantime, people don't receive those same sorts of benefits, and banks aren't required to provide that to them. So if a bank's getting money cheaply from the Fed and giving the Fed in return, sort of cheap assets that they have that they want to get rid of, which is kind of what happens, and then they get the interest on that money, they do very well out of that sort of triangular arrangement. Whereas people, yes, from a taxpayer standpoint, they're feeding into the assets that the bank owns by providing them deposits, which in turn become loans, which banks use to basically grow their own business, but they're not getting really compensated for providing that collateral, that capital to the banks. They're getting, a quarter to like a third of a percent on their money. And many people, not only are they getting very little on their money in interest, they're paying fees to these banks, for example, if they're below a certain balance, or potentially for wiring money or for other types of services. So they're effectively paying banks to use their money, whereas banks are getting paid by the Fed to receive their money. So yes, there is a way in which we're subsidizing this at the citizen level.
Yeah. Now, you spent some time in Mexico as your lead up to Collusion. What sort of things did you learn in Mexico?
Well, one of the things and one of the reasons I started in Mexico in chapter in Collusion and went to other places in the world from there is because in tracing back the events that were occurring in the beginning of the financial crisis, what I discovered through interviews there and then sort of public information to sort of validate them is that in the beginning of the crisis, when Ben Bernanke, who was the chairman of the Fed at the time, the chair of the board of governors of the Fed at the time, decided that he would embark upon this money creation activity, a scheme, I call it, called quantitative easing, which is just a wonky word to say we create money in order to give it to banks. We receive assets they don't want to sell or can't sell anyway in return, and we pay them interest on it. When he started that, the head of the Central Bank of Mexico at the time, a man named Guillermo Ortiz, who had been around in sort of the past when Mexico had real financial problems in 1994. They had something called the tequila crisis. Their currency was smacked. Their banks were going under. Their people were all disrupted. And he was involved in helping to sort of build up from there. And so he went to Washington in the fall of 2008, and he had a meeting with Ben Bernanke, and he said, I see where this is going. And he kind of conveyed to Bernanke that, look, you guys didn't do the best regulation, they should have done going into this financial crisis. But be that as it may, if you start to subsidize these banks and you don't pay attention to kind of instilling the confidence of the American people in the banking system, then at some point down the line, that's going to sort of, come back to haunt you. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically one of the stories which I got from talking to one of the people who had worked with Ortiz at the time, who was retiring from the bank and who had basically seen, this story play out before. And they're really trying to sort of warn the U.S. that this might not be the best, at some point, process to go by. But as a result, Ben Bernanke, first of all, ignored him. He ignored him, like completely ignored him in his memoirs. He just ignored that whole thing. It's like he went willful ignoring. Thank you. And Ortiz, unfortunately, he started to sort of sound the alarm throughout Central America, Latin America, and some of the Asian countries like China and so forth. They started to look at what the Fed was starting to create in terms of this fabricated money, and they started to be critical. As a result, Ortiz actually lost his position, or was not reappointed to run the central bank because he had crossed Ben Bernanke at the time, even though he had and then he went on sort of the speaking circuit, and he's still an advisor to the Dallas Fed. I mean, these people do sort of resurrect themselves, but he really was taken out of that sort of elite position because he wanted to maintain a policy from the Central Bank of Mexico that would help the economy of Mexico and the people of Mexico while it was being decimated by the financial crisis happening in the United States. And that didn't go over well politically in the United States and ultimately back to him. So one of the things I start to show in the book is sort of the ramifications of the people who throughout the world who over the years criticized not for the sheer hell of it, but, because they assume that creating money would create asset bubbles, ultimately would create instability. It might take a while, but that would happen. And as a result, lost their positions of sort of the most power in the global central bank community because they didn't do what the Fed wanted them to do. And there's like a through line of that through many different countries. But it was very apparent in Mexico because of the types of individuals that were leading these institutions and what they tried to do, and how they the ramifications for that.
So we're looking at a central bank. What are the pros, and then what are the cons of a central bank? And should a bank be private or should it be public?
Yeah, I mean a central bank. If it literally is in a position where it does what it says, which is that it regulates the banking system to an extent that criminal activity doesn't happen in such a way that it then
Yeah.
slams the financial system and hurts us. Well, that would be a good example of what a central bank could do. They get centralized information from these banks. They know when they're low on reserves and there could be problems. And let's say they warn them and they receive more reserves. And if there's a problem, they work out ways for these banks to not take 10 years of help from the Fed, but some shorter period of time to potentially get over it and also help people that were hurt around the time. That could be a good use of a central bank. The problem is that's not that's not really what happened. What
practice.
happened?
Yeah.
It's not practice. And so even when a central bank says, "Well, our mission is to," which ours does, has a dual mandate to keep full employment and inflation of prices at sort of a check. That's really kind of secondary to the fact that they produced a lot of money that happened to have gone into mostly the stock market and to infuse a lot of debt in the Treasury Department as well as in the bond markets throughout the world, and that ultimately this debt has to be repaid, as does the government debt that was created in the last 10 years need to be repaid. And in that case, again, the central bank is in this position where it has no limitations on the money it creates, but the ramifications of its policy could be very broad. And I think in that scenario, the central bank's actually dangerous to their local economy, to the global economy, and should at the very least have time or amount limitations on how they can help subsidize the private banking system. I mean, there is some credence to the idea that if a private bank is so extended that it can't function anymore, well, and it did so under its own volition and it bet wrong and it and all of that using other people's money as collateral, well, maybe it shouldn't get to be as big and maybe it shouldn't get to survive in that capacity. But that's not what the Federal Reserve sort of worked towards. It worked towards just sustaining and in fact making bigger the too big to fail banks that were at the center of the financial crisis. And so they've really overstepped even the good that central banks could have done, I think, by acting as if the money they've created has somehow sustained economies, whereas in fact, there's an exact correlation between what they've created and rises in the stock market to the day. When they create more money, the stock market goes up. When less money, the stock market goes down. With all the fundamentals that we look at about companies in the stock market, the reality is the overriding factor in the last 10 years has been when the Federal Reserve or other major central banks create or announce they're going to create extra money into the system. And that's really been how markets have been driven over the last 10 years.
Nomi, you spent time in London. Now, the financial center in London is perhaps if not one of the top three financial centers globally. Is the Federal Reserve System that we know it, that's implemented in the United States, does it consist, in your opinion, does it consist of international shareholders?
It's interesting because the way in which private banks work today is they're very codependent on each other. And so, they're almost, especially the larger ones. For example, Deutsche Bank, the largest bank in Germany, was one of the banks that the Federal Reserve helped or subsidized back in the beginning of the financial crisis because it was connected and its positions were connected to, big U.S. banks like J.P. Morgan Chase or Citigroup and so forth. So from the standpoint of our Fed in particular, the international kind of reach that it has is quite wide. So though these banks aren't necessarily members of the Federal Reserve in the same way a headquartered U.S. bank would be members of the Federal Reserve, they are sort of recipients of the way in which the Federal Reserve works. Now, in London, the Bank of England works slightly differently from the Federal Reserve in that, first of all, it's one entity instead of this idea of a reserve system where there's little pieces of the Fed throughout the United States, even though the main Fed is in Washington, the second main Fed's in New York. And the Bank of England head, unlike in the United States where it's appointed and then approved by our Congress, in the UK it's just simply appointed by whoever the Prime Minister is, and so there's a more direct link into the government of the Bank of England relative to the government. So they do have a tighter connection into buying sort of UK government bonds, into helping UK banks, some of which also are supported by the government in the UK, especially in the wake of the financial crisis. Some of them were even sort of nationalized to an extent by the government, by the UK government, and those were in turn subsidized by the Bank of England, whereas that didn't really happen in the United States. These are just, really wonky semantics, but it's just to say that the different banks throughout the world operate slightly differently relative to their own country, but from a global perspective, the main central banks, the G7 central banks in particular, really adopted a similar policy, which was to follow the Fed's policy throughout these past 10 years, which was to create a lot of money to buy either government debt or other kinds of debt out of their system in order to provide it to their private banks. And so the method was pretty much the same. The amounts differed. I mean, the Fed created $4.5 trillion worth of money in their quantitative easing programs. The Bank of England created like 800 billion, but I mean, it's a smaller country. So net though, they did similar things, and they did them. They're timed in such a way, and I go through this in Collusion, that they were timed in ways to help the markets. I help the financial institutions in the markets when they most needed it, literally on days when they most needed it.
In your view, is should listeners to understand the power that the Federal Reserve has? A, do you feel that it should be audited, and B, are there circumstances in which you would consider it being more powerful than the White House?
It's a really interesting question. I definitely think it should be audited, without a doubt. When I say audited, I don't mean just they show a report of like where they have invested in certain different types of assets. Like, we have so many treasuries on our books, we have so many mortgage securities on our books, which they do on a weekly basis. But what audited from the real standpoint of how their members actually operate, what they get, what they use, and look at it as a real company. I definitely think that that's necessary. It hasn't ever been done on that level. It's been proposed over the years. I mean, it was most recently proposed by a sort of contingent of Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders at one point in a number of years after the crisis, but it's never really taken off. And it is something that Congress could demand or even enact. Because they were the ones who basically gave the Fed the power to begin with in 1913. They just completely abdicate responsibility to the Fed. So going back to the other part of your question, is it more powerful than the White House? The reality is that the White House has the Treasury Department to create money, and that money has a process. When we borrow or create a bond, or the Treasury Department creates a bond or borrows money, from investors through the banking system. And borrows money from other countries as well, and so forth. There's a process by which that happens, and it goes. There's auctions, there's times, there's amounts. It's all very sort of streamlined and has limits, whereas the Federal Reserve doesn't have limits as to how much they can decide to create in an emergency, as they've done in these last 10 years. So in that respect, they stopped at $4.5 trillion. I mean, they equally could have stopped at 12 trillion. I mean, they just decided that was how much money they thought was necessary. And if you have that kind of power, and they utilized that kind of power in the last 10 years, that kind of power wasn't utilized to that extent beforehand. That's really tremendous. The White House can't really do that. The White House has to go through Congress to allocate money and stuff to different areas of our budget, whereas the Fed just kind of created it. So from a financial perspective, it's actually more powerful.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Ellen Brown? She ran for treasurer in the state of California a number of years ago, and she's written a book that actually is based off of a banking practice that North Dakota has adopted. And the title of the book is basically the public banking system. Are you familiar with Ellen Brown and that concept?
Well, yes, I'm actually familiar with Ellen Brown. We've spoken together in the past at different venues, and as well as the public banking concept. And to summarize that and why that could be or should be really adopted throughout at the very least state levels and potentially at the federal level, is the idea of a public bank is really simple. It's not like a publicly subsidized bank. I've actually had conversations with Ellen about whether a different term could be used to sort of broaden what it really is meant to be, which is a bank that provides through its lending capacities loans or financing for things that are required in terms of infrastructure development or jobs or so forth in the area in which it operates. So in North Dakota, for example, the public banker of North Dakota was created actually in 1909, and it was created a little bit before the Fed, but it was created for a very similar purpose to why the Fed was promised to be created, but it actually served that purpose, which was that money was not coming into North Dakota to the extent that they needed it from the big Eastern banks. So it was kind of, there'd been a big crisis in finance in 1907. There was a panic in New York. The Wall Street banks basically stopped lending throughout the rest of the country. They kind of kept it to themselves, which is very similar to what happened 100 years later. But North Dakota, as a result of that, said, you know what, we're going to just kind of take care of ourselves. We have taxes here. We have revenues here. Over the years, they've had oil revenues and so forth there. We're just going to take these receipts and we're going to use them to finance a bank that will then give back to our state. And as a result of that, they've actually, that bank has performed better and more consistently and with less sort of ups and downs than a bank like JP Morgan Chase because they've been able to manage their money for their own purposes. That, they get it in and then they decide where it needs to be lent. That's one of the reasons, for example, student loans are so reduced in the state of North Dakota because the bank actually is able to provide loans at lower rates than in other places because it has revenues from the state to basically back those loans with. So that would be the idea of a public bank, is to have those in areas where receipts from the state or from a local city or whatever are used to help collateralize a bank that runs as a bank. I mean, it doesn't have to act silly, but it decides what it finances based on practical decisions and analysis. But it doesn't decide, for example, to invest in speculative trade as to, I don't know how the Russian ruble is going to do relative to the euro or something. I mean, it works on what's in the community or in the vicinity of where it operates.
Nomi, historically, you mentioned 1907. Historically, would you say that as the United States has grown, 1776, 250 years roughly, has there been collusion in place since the days of Alexander Hamilton? Is that something that the Republic has faced on a yearly basis? Is that something you can assess through your studies and research?
Well, I mean, there's been different forms of collusion. There was always been a strong connection between, so the wealthiest or most elite, families or individuals running private banking institutions versus, the people that run for office in their states or at the federal level. I mean, that's always been, sort of part of our republic to an extent. But in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of how we're set up from a official perspective, I think that has gotten worse over the years. Actually, my last book, I go through a real evolution of this, where it really has a turning point in the 1970s when private banks basically discover petrodollars and oil money, and they realize they don't even have to care what the government is doing. So even though they have these elite connections, they don't have to use them to benefit the U.S. in particular. They can just benefit their banks, and everything kind of goes haywire. And I trace that those relationships changing and the way in which banking changes as a result from the 70s on through today. But then in the last 10 years, again, that's just gotten worse because the collusion is rather global. I mean, that's kind of what we have now. There's a level of collusion between the central bank and the private banks, and then there's a level of collusion between central banks amongst each other. And so we have this globalized collusion, which is hasn't not existed in the past. I mean, it was something that was used for different world wars and financing and so forth, but there were actual real reasons to sort of fabricate money, whereas now it's literally just to subsidize a sort of out of whack private banking system.
I look at the United Nations, and there's an attempt, which is obviously to kind of stabilize the different cultures and languages and whatever it may be globally. I mean, I'm assuming that's kind of the overall objective with the United Nations. In your view, should the United Nations attempt to formulate a central bank?
Well, I think I think that, in terms of it being financial versus sort of diplomatic, there's a sort of element of not the United Nations, but sort of the globalized
Yeah.
idea that with the IMF or the World Bank or so forth, which in their pure form, we're supposed to have looked at sort of the globe, in the wake of World War II, and decided based on strong countries versus weaker countries that needed to develop their infrastructure and grow after they've been decimated by wars and
Right.
so forth, and figure out how to finance that and make decisions on how to equalize the world, or at least to keep it stable. I mean, that was sort of the intent
Yeah.
of those institutions. That's interesting right now because the IMF is actually very critical of what the Fed's doing and of the debt that's been created in sort of the developing or the emerging markets because of these quantitative easing processes. So I don't know that necessarily another major central sort of entity would be the answer. I think it's more that there should be a regulating entity to at least sort of ensure that if we do have central banks, that they're not simply creating funding for the private banking system, but there's an accountability aspect that they have to go to on the world stage, just like there's humanitarian accountabilities. There's no financial accountabilities for these institutions. There's no, there are centralized bodies for central banks, but they don't have that impact. And I think having something like that would be very useful, because the question would then be asked, and it would be official, and there would be information and requirement and accountability and responsibility to it. Why did you create all this money, and why did it go to JP Morgan Chase, and how come, or why did it go to Deutsche Bank and not to Greece, or whatever the questions might be, and make them actually answer these questions. I mean, when I was in the UK just recently, I was speaking at Parliament, and I was invited there by the shadow secretary of the sort of industrial sector, and she looks at real production and technology and so forth, and we're having this conversation about the Central Bank of England and how come they've created all this money, but it hasn't gone to actually sort of upgrading or building the country.
Yeah.
And I said to her, you got to someone needs to make these people accountable to that. The money was created, like it needs to be diverted at this point, at least.
Yeah. Nomi, there's a $20 trillion debt in this country. I mean, we're kind of getting short on time. I want to throw a few things out there. You can kind of maybe pick and choose from what you want. But the $20 trillion debt in this country, should Americans be alarmed at that? How would you envision them getting out of that? Does it correlate to the Federal Reserve? In your view, is fractional reserve banking an issue that Americans should be concerned about? And if listeners aren't clear about what that is, it's basically lending out $1 and then the recipient bank having fractionating it 10 times. What and then lastly, Nomi, what is your overall goal with this book? Where would you like it to go? How would you like it to affect people?
Right. So, I mean, from the standpoint of how I'd like it to affect people, just go in opposite order. I would like for people to just be more aware of how their money and their use of money is dictated upon by a set of institutions and people that aren't accountable to them, that aren't elected, that are simply selected and appointed, and that don't have to be transparent and have the ability to help who they want to help, and have no sort of responsibility to the overall country in the process, and in fact create as a result inequality in our country and throughout the world as a process. And people should learn that from the book, and hopefully they'll get a sense of also just how the world works. I mean, I went around the world, China, Japan, throughout Europe, Brazil, so forth, and just how we actually are one community, and the central banking system is sort of an elite community above that. In terms of the debt that's then created, as a result of these very low interest rate policies, particularly amongst the developed or G7 countries, at the sort of push of the Fed and the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and so forth, have these low to negative rates. That impacts people in two ways. It impacts them by, again, not having the ability to save money and receive any interest on it that means anything. But it also means that, as you say, the United States has this mega debt, as do a lot of these other nations, which is much more than their GDP, or at least over 100% times their GDP, which means we're not producing as much as we're borrowing. And what that means is that we're borrowing from the future to produce less and less today. And that should worry anybody who is planning on living into the future, who has children, who has grandchildren or whatever, because, this is something that perpetuates at some point.
Yeah.
The reason that all debt was created so cheaply was because the Fed and other central banks made it so cheap to borrow money. But at some point you have to repay that money, and at some point rates will go up and it will be more expensive to service or repay that money. And then that's when we're going to see more and more things being cut from our budgets, whether it's state or federal budgets, to compensate for repaying what we borrowed, as opposed to having built with it throughout the way and borrowed less.
Yeah, wonderfully said. Final words from you, final thoughts from you. What can the average American do? What can listeners do?
Well, again, besides, I think, educating, beware, talking it amongst, friends and so forth. I mean, it's not the sort of sexiest topic, but it is something that really impacts, Federal Reserve does actually impact everyone's life a lot more than they think, and certainly their money. And I think it's important to know that and to discuss that. And I think also just like little tiny things in your own financial life. I mean, these banks are still, as I said at the beginning of the show, giving people like nothing on their savings account. At least don't have your accounts, at least your savings accounts with these banks. The banks that got less money from the Federal Reserve and help, like some of the online banks, and they don't give a lot of interest, but they're giving 1.65 to 1.9 versus 0.25. And they don't have fees. So it's just a minor thing. People could make a lot more return on their own savings just by spending the time taking it out of their main bank and putting it into some of these ones that'll actually give it a little bit more interest.
So abolish the Federal Reserve or just tweak it?
I think at this point, tweaking is not really strong enough. I mean, I think the Federal Reserve really needs to go back to to being a regulatory body, to not being able to just create money to save the institutions that it is supposed to regulate. And if it can become a regulatory body, where it's really literally just there in emergencies, and it's literally just there to ensure that banks don't require all of this assistance for so many years in so many ways, then it could be useful. That's more than a tweak. That's like a full-on restructuring, because that involves auditing. That involves what I think should be electing people who run the Federal Reserve, rather than simply appointing them and making them more accountable to people, because their policies actually do affect everyone.
Beautifully said, Nomi. Thank you for joining Winwood Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, Nomi Prins.
Thank you.
And I will cut to a break and be right back with you to close this out. Nomi Prins, folks. I quit Wall Street and decided that it was time to talk more about what was going on inside it, as it had changed. It had become far more sinister and far more dangerous.
You're listening to WinwoodRadio.com.
Carried Away. Sorry, cut that. That was a nice guitar. Going into a nice guitar there. The Four Horsemen. Dean Henderson actually has been past guest on the program, and that is the title he chose. Big Banks, Big Oil, the Four Horsemen. That's archives, of course. I want to re-mention that this is now uploaded. If you want to catch this, please send it out to your friends, family. They can listen to it in iTunes. They can now listen to it in Google Podcasts. We are gratefully indebted to Winwood Radio for this platform that we broadcast from, that I broadcast from every Wednesday. Nomi Prins is possibly best known for her book, All the President's Bankers, the hidden alliances that drive American power. Now, you have to listen attentively to the words that she says, but she's sending out a very loud and strong alarm. She's well composed, and she treads very lightly in the way that she says things. But by all means, don't sit back and rest on your laurels, folks. There is a major pending catastrophic change that could quite possibly be hitting the financial markets in the United States. If you are unable to audit and open up the books of what these shareholders call a federal. Federal means public. It's nothing public about it. And if you are unable to look into their undertakings, then you, as an American citizen, have no way of gauging and applying your best economic minds to the tasks of avoiding said crash. I hope I've said that well. And I think that is a general message that is conveyed through Nomi's book that was just released, Collusion: How Central Bankers Rigged the World. And that would have been a good question to ask her to actually expand on that. But I think we get a pretty good general idea. She provided a plethora and a wealth of information, and we're very grateful to have her have joined us. Next week, June 27th, I will be right back here with you, presenting Wolf Street. We're going to go into banking yet again, and this time with Wolf Richter, who's a financial analyst and economics commentator based in San Francisco. He's the founder and CEO of Wolf Street Corp, publisher of WolfStreet.com. July 4th, Independence Day, is when we will be hosting Robert Bridge, who, again, is an investigative journalist. So Nomi went from banking, and you heard her say this, to becoming a journalist. So that right there should say a lot about the passion that drives her to help people understand what's going on in a private central bank. And the most powerful one on this planet happens to be the one that you are subjugated to as an American citizen if you're listening in the United States, and that would be the Federal Reserve. Let me just go back and read this quote. By Representative Louis T. McFadden. Okay. Actually, we have in this country one of the most, this is 1915, corrupt institutions the world has ever known. Has it changed much since? I refer to the Federal Reserve System, he says. This evil institution has impoverished the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. And I'm going to also repeat, Charles A. Lindbergh, former United States congressman, this is the same era, 1922. He said, the financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. That board administers a financial system by authority of a purely profiteering group. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. And that system, instituted in 1913 under Woodrow Wilson, is completely private. That means you, as an American citizen, as a taxpayer, as a person that has every inalienable. The system itself would seem inhumane, but you would not be. Inalienable right to know exactly what's going on in it. Okay? Yet you don't. And yet we don't. So, there we have it. Let me close out and continue with Robert Bridge. He's an American investigative journalist who came to July 4th again. Living in Moscow, a native of Pittsburgh, his book, Midnight in the American Empire, is a harsh critic of the United States foreign affair and policy. Bridge is a former editor-in-chief of the Moscow News. Again, I'm going to repeat the title of his book, Midnight in the American Empire. And by the way, geoengineering, yeah, it's really happening. Folks, Wynwood Radio, I've been your host, as always, Wednesdays at 5 o'clock, Ian Hamilton Trottier. Thank you for tuning in. Check out iantrottier.com. That's IENTROTTIER. I have all my past guests archived on the website. Subscribe to me on iTunes. Now you can subscribe to me on Google Podcasts. And I appreciate you tuning in. And until next week, be awesome.